This first sequence is going to be targeted toward the hips. We'll have 3 different major sequences that we will do. And this will work pretty much most of the body from just above the knees, into the knees, and up into the lower part of the spine. As the name implies, it is pretty much trying to induce and develop a range of motion in the lower pelvis, hip-leg articulations. The first posture that the students are sitting in here, we call seiza, Japanese word for kneeling. And just before they go into this, in a more meditative state, we like to do a few Taoist or full circular breaths. And so taking a lead with an exhalation, if you open your palms out to the side, and on the inhalation, slowly reach up over your head, quietly gathering the chi from the environment around you. Once you reach the limit of your inhalation, you pause for a moment before turning the palms downward and trying to feel or coax the chi descending down through the top of the head, down through the spine, all the way guiding it down to the lower abdomen, called the dantian. In an unforced, unhurried way, continue this on to the next immediate, smooth, quiet, gentle inhalation. Gathering the chi. When the palms are turned upwards to heaven, you're gathering the chi. You turn the palms downwards, and the chi descends. Gathering to the dantian at the lower abdomen. And then one more time, just to develop a sensitivity and awareness of the chi. Inhaling, reaching up, pausing for a moment before bringing the palms over and down and coaxing the chi down through the top of the body, down through the spine, gathering the chi at the lower abdomen. Then fold your hands, palms on your lap. In a yin practice, typically we hold postures 4 or 5 minutes or more. The exceptions to that are when we do asymmetrical postures or postures that are quite strenuous for the musculature. The ideal in yin is that we're trying to target fascia and ligament. Certain of the postures, it's difficult to target and isolate those tissues. Impossible, really. You have to stretch the muscles that overlie the joints. And whenever you're stretching muscle, you can, of course, stretch them in a yin fashion. You could stretch the muscles for minutes and minutes and minutes at a time, and that would be fine. But those are the times generally when we don't hold the postures as long. And this is really for beginners, so they don't become overly aggressive and strain a muscle in their introduction to yin. But the norm, if you can call it that, is 4 or 5 minutes in the beginning. The exceptions, again, are when the postures are more muscular or when the postures are asymmetrical. One of the strong elements of a yin practice, as you settle into it, is you try to feel your bones. You try to feel the joints and the weight of the pelvis and the spine and the hips and the thighs. You try to turn your attention away from the muscles of the body, which are easy to feel, easy to stimulate, and try to turn the attention towards the bones. You can feel the bones all the time. It just has to take a little bit of training, a certain change of the inner reflection or attitude, so that the adjustments that you make and the variations that you do become more effective for the bones rather than necessarily more effective for the muscles. This is one of the primary differences in a yin practice. It's not about strengthening the muscles so much as it's gently plying the joints and plying the bones and tempering them and making them soft. Now for our first posture, active posture, twisting dragon pose. So if you'd lean forward onto your hands and bring your right foot forward, a moderate step, Bring your left forearm or hand to the floor, whatever feels most comfortable, and gently turn and twist over to your right. How you hold your hand, the offhand, the right hand, is optional and variable. So already you can see Susie pressing off her knee with her hand to increase and to exaggerate the external rotation. Chrysander bringing her hand down more towards her hip. Torsten and Brian resting their arms and hands in different positions. In a yin practice, you want to be careful about trying to posture something like your neck in any one position and holding it there forever. Yin yoga is primarily concerned with the area between your ribs and your knee. We're primarily concerned with the lower sections of the skeleton and the hips and the pelvis. That being the case, you can occasionally look up. And when that becomes tedious and painful to keep the muscles contracted that long, relax the head, relax the neck whenever you feel necessary. The focus is on the lower body. The focus is not on up into the neck, up into the shoulders. It is typical and common that as you progress in this posture, your original hand position is no longer comfortable or effective. This is the norm. So 30 seconds into a pose, 60 seconds into a pose, 90 seconds into the pose, you might want to shift your arm or your hand or your head or your foot or your knee to a slightly different position. Because the body is changing, your muscles are changing and yielding, the fascia is slowly starting to react to the stresses that you put on it. So don't try to assume the perfect pose when you first get into it. Don't be in a rush to go as deep as you can. Feel your way into the pose. And most of the postures should look and feel different at the end of 2 or 3 or 4 minutes than they did in the beginning. And change sides, please. Shift the right leg back and bring your left foot forward. Bring your right hand or forearm down to the floor, whatever feels comfortable. Place your hand on your knee or overhanging your thigh with your bicep. The hand position is the most optional of things. And that's because everyone's flexibilities and proportions are so different. What's completely comfortable for one arm and hand position is very awkward and constraining for another person. And again, staying focused on what is the primary purpose of a pose is a big thing in a yin practice. That's why the arm, the head, the neck, the shoulder, from person to person, these little details of position might be different, very different from one person to another. Chrysander's head and chest is up, Brian's head and chest is down, Torsten is looking up towards the ceiling, Susie's looking distally past her left leg. How do you roll your pelvis? Do you endeavor to keep your pelvis level, or do you endeavor to roll the right thigh towards the floor? These are things that you as the individual practitioner should feel out. Now, when you take a long posture like this, it's important that you feel comfortable. So one of the things you might do in a posture here is if the heel comes off the floor, you're going to probably feel the most unstable. Now, if you can tolerate that, it's not a problem. But to make yourself feel more stable, if Torsten wished to, he could slide this leg back enough that the heel comes down. So if you feel unstable on your foot, make sure you have good contact on the floor with the balls of the feet and the heel. Some people don't need that, other people do. And then change sides again, please. Stepping back with the left foot, bring the right foot forward again. But this time it's the dragon pose, not twisting dragon, but just regular dragon pose. The hallmark of this posture is a shorter step. The idea is not so much to twist and stretch and sink low as it is to work the ankle and the Achilles Important points for the kidney and urinary bladder meridians, very important points for drawing energy from the earth. When the ankles become tight, painful to bend and to move, the two major meridians on the insides and the outsides of the ankles become less effective drawing chi from the earth, and we're more easily fatigued. This is one of the reasons why, when the warm weather comes after a cold winter, it's nice to take your shoes off. If you live near the beach, walk the beach. To work and feel the energy of the earth through the feet. So this posture is more about the front leg, actually, even though there is a stress on the back leg. And how much stress is on this back leg is highly dependent on how you posture your upper body. Susie, by holding her torso high, is putting a lot of pressure directly down through the hip flexors on the back thigh. Torsten is at the opposite extreme. He's taking some of the weight on the body of his hands. So some of his torso weight is carried through his arms, which alleviates some of the stress that might be coming through his leg. Not everyone can pull the body up and take all the stresses in the front ankle and in the back hip flexors. So don't feel constrained that you must someday bring your torso upright. This may always be inappropriate depending on your strengths and flexibilities of the joints that you're working. And chain sides, please. Draw your right leg back and bring your left foot forward. Dragon pose. Anytime we're in a stance in this position, we refer to this as dragon pose or something similar like gecko pose. There are several variations of these postures. Very common, the most common thing in the world, in fact, that the two sides are different. Sometimes just a minor difference in the flexibilities of the hip and the ankle and the thigh, and sometimes a major difference. So don't be overly concerned or think that you're the only one when you're doing a practice, this practice or any practice in yoga, when you find dramatic differences between the two sides of the body. Because our bones are different, these differences cannot always be overcome. Certainly, it makes sense to try to intelligently stretch the soft tissues of the body, the muscles and the tendons and the ligaments, to try and even out the asymmetries of our skeletons. But you have to maturely accept the fact that certain limitations are built into the bones. And to strive overmuch to balance one side like the other leads sometimes to too aggressive type of motions and movements. This is a nice example of you don't always have to have your foot flat on the floor. Because Susie is more experienced at this posture, her heel is actually off the ground. Just a little, just enough. But her experience has taught her that gives her the most pleasant feeling and stretch in the ankles and the Achilles. For someone else, to have the heel off the ground like that might make them feel unstable. And once again, you just slide that back leg back, which is again the equivalent of taking a bigger step. So you feel better contact with the earth between the balls of your feet and the heels of your feet on the floor. And once again, just like the other side, whether you bring your body down and low or arch your body up and back, this will change the emphasis. Do you put more emphasis when Torsten comes forward? He can actually put his whole body weight into this knee and thigh, maybe even have a more powerful stretch on his ankle. But he will have to compromise how much stress goes back here because he shifted the body weight forward. This is desirable for some people. In other cases, it could be completely the opposite extreme, where Chrysanda would actually bring her body back even more dramatically just to put more weight through this muscle tendinous attachment and not overemphasize the front of the foot. So how you position the upper body can change quite dramatically how much stress you feel in the front ankle, foot, thigh, hip as opposed to the back, hip, and thigh. And step back again, please, and chain sides. The final of these variations, the gecko, variation of the dragon, its characteristic is a big step, a much bigger step than the others. And then we try to bring our arms inside of the knee, either to hands, palms, or to the forearms. The idea is to lunge deeper than all the other variations into the hamstring and groin of the front leg. Still, the characteristic of stretching the hip flexors on the back leg is there, but this large, wide step, arms down, is putting more stress into the hamstring and groin of the front leg. The ultimate example of that being the demonstration of what Chrysandra's doing of you can't get a bigger step than the splits. You've exaggerated the leverages of this posture to the extreme. And once you're in the splits, again, the two different opposite torso positionings. Susie in the splits, torso is up. This puts more strain and leverage into the back hip, and of course more of a gentle arch into the spine. Chrysandra, her torso is positioned forward and down in the horizontal. This gets a more powerful hamstring stretch on the front leg. Two different extremes. Which leg are we trying to emphasize the most? Leaning forward emphasizes the stress on the front leg. Rising up and back emphasizes the stresses on the hip of the back leg. And one more time. Change sides, please. Drawing the right leg back and bringing the left foot forward. The characteristic of the gecko is this big step, a wide step. The two sides, of course, will usually be different. Sometimes it's a minor difference. Sometimes it's a major difference. The angle of the knee and the angle of the front foot, this is entirely individual. Some people, the knee carries wide to the side, and other people, the knee carries more straight forward. And the foot usually parallels the position of that knee. How wide the knee turns out is typical of how wide the foot turns out. This is not always the case. Some people feel more comfortable with the foot externally rotated. So if the front foot is externally rotated slightly more than the knee, they actually feel better support this way. This is not always the case. But since this joint is not bearing a lot of weight, however you feel comfortable on that front leg is fine. Most of the weight is being borne by the arms and the torso and the body. All of yin yoga shares this characteristic, that even though we are trying to focus on the bones and the fascia of the body, it's virtually impossible to eliminate those structures and isolate them away from the muscles. So there's always a muscular element involved in a yin practice. That being the case, sometimes tensing a muscle, such as tensing the muscle in your thigh or tensing the muscle in your groin and then relaxing it, can be helpful to settle in for a longer, more comfortable time into a yin pose. And slowly step back. Child's pose for a moment. Just to rest the stretch on the ankles and the knees and the groin. And then we come right away, we jump right into what we call the dragonfly. Sitting, splits, legs wide apart. So if you'll come up, sitting down, legs in front, bring your feet wide. And slowly try to roll your pelvis forward. Now this is truly a yin posture. What makes it a yin posture, or why I would characterize it that way, is because it doesn't take any strength to balance in this pose. So the muscles are much less involved in this posture. Remember, there are no absolute yin. There's no absolute yang. There are no perfectly yin postures that only work yin tissues and not muscular tissue. There are no absolutes. There are relative things. And this is one of them, particularly if you look at people more flexible in their pelvis and their thighs. Chrysandra and Susie, when these women come forward and down, certainly balance or strength is not an issue here. Now for Torsten, because of tension in his pelvis here, where the bones abut or compress against his pelvis, it's virtually impossible for him to tilt his pelvis forward, which is why he's adapted this arm position to hold his torso upright. This is a perfectly acceptable variation of this pose, which we call the dragonfly pose, but I'm going to suggest another one, and that is frog. So if we'll have Torsten come out of this posture, get on his knees, much like child's pose, but knees wide apart, and then slowly bring his body down and forward. Now he too can rotate his pelvis, working into the joint here and into his groin. And it's not such a strength or arduous or a tedious sometimes posture to hold yourself braced on your arms that way. To brace yourself on your arms or to keep your spine erect in a muscular movement is perfectly fine for 30 seconds or 60 seconds or in a typical yang class, but it can be tedious to do it for minutes and minutes and minutes at a time. We're now 2 minutes into a 4-minute posture. So what Torsten doesn't get out of this posture is a strong hamstring stretch, but he still gets a very strong and beneficial working of this hip joint in here and of the liver and kidney meridians through his groin. The other variability in this pose is what does it work also is dependent on one's flexibilities. Typically, what is most dependent upon is what is the rotation of the pelvis. The tilt of Susie's sacrum or pelvis, where my palm is virtually parallel to the floor, which means there's no stretch to her lower spine. Torsten has a very gentle stretch to the spine. Chrysandra has virtually no stretch to her spine, but slightly in this area because of how it's rounded. And then Brian, because his pelvis is slanted at about 45 degrees, his spine is going to be rounded. So for Chrysandra and for Susie, perhaps no stress on the sacrum lower spine. For Brian, there will always be some stress or tension or decompression in this region. So the posture doesn't affect all bodily types the same. And slowly come up, please. You can draw your legs in, hug your knees for a moment, sort of relaxing the tension that develops in the groin. And then we go into the next two postures, one after the other. First we call sleeping swan. So if you would bring your right foot forward, turning the right knee out. Stretch the left thigh back behind you. You sort of wiggle yourself down into the earth with your pelvis and your thigh. And when you're ready, lay your body forward and down over that leg. We call this the sleeping swan. And as you can see, everyone's pelvis, how high the pelvis is the pelvis tilted to the left or to the right, is slightly different for everybody. Sometimes these differences in how the pelvis is tilted or rolled to the left or to the right or the front or to the back is because the muscles of the fascia are tight, and it will change over time as these tissues yield to this posture over the weeks and the months and the years. Some of these things will always be dramatically different from one student to the other because of the differences in their bones. So what's important to try to communicate is not where the pelvis should be, because that will be different for everybody, but what we're trying to communicate to a student or a practitioner is where to feel the stress. In this posture, archetypally, we would like to feel the stress down here, just to the lateral portion of the iliosacral joint, over this bony section of the pelvis, and down the lateral part of the thigh. That tract is the IT band, physiologically. Energetically, it's the gallbladder channel. It has a huge influence over the sciatic nerve, the largest, biggest nerve of the body. That's primarily where we would like the stress. Sometimes people will feel slight stresses on the back leg, but not nearly as much as in the dragon variations that we've already demonstrated. So once you have been satisfied for yourself, what is the primary objective of a pose? Everything else being secondary, everything else is optional. Where do you place your head? How do you hold your hands? How do you roll your pelvis to the left or to the right? Do you tense the back leg or do you relax the back leg? Where should the foot position be? All of these are important details, but there are no absolutes on what is correct. There are two ways to do a posture wrong in a yin practice, and they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. One is you do it in such a way so aggressively that you hurt yourself. That's wrong. Two, you do it in such a way that you have no effective stress or traction on the area where you want it. You're not going to hurt yourself, but you're wasting your time. So an active, living, breathing yin practice on an active, living, breathing, different, unique bodies looks different on everybody. The biggest variations being, how high up can you bring your foot? For Chrysandra, it's easily level to her head and her shoulders, and her foot can actually extend beyond that if she wished to. For Susie, Torsten, and Brian, their foot is very far down close to their hip. The reason for this is that if you don't have the innate hip flexibilities in this joint and you try to bring your foot up, the stresses go to your knee and to your ankle. So how high the foot should be isn't the question. It's how high can I bring my foot without putting stresses on my knee or my ankle? And then we stay in this basic posture, but we arch up into the swan proper. This is the sleeping swan, and now elevate your body. And when you come up into the swan, you can change your foot and or your knee position. Even your pelvis position you can change. You can change everything in your lower body. You can wiggle your hip and your pelvis and your thigh and your knee to a slightly different position, so that you want to just feel stable and relatively comfortable in the base, so that you are free to put some gentle stress into the compression of back bend in the lower spine, some gentle stretch across the front of your thigh. These are the primary intentions of this swan posture. Now, for some people, they're always going to feel it the way they do in the sleeping swan, in this region of the body. That's not the intention, it's just you can't get around it. Because of how they're built or how tight their fascia is, they have to do it that way. But the primary intention, other than that, is not where you posture this foot, but how do you posture your back and your shoulders and your head, gently arching into the lower spine for the first time. Chrysandra demonstrates an extreme variation where you bend the back leg up, reaching and grabbing the back foot with one or both hands. Susie demonstrates an example of exaggerating the stress not so much on the spine, but on the hip flexors of the back thigh. needless to say, these variations are not accessible to all body types. But if they are accessible to you, these are perfectly viable things to explore. And then slowly, gently release. Step back into the downward dog for a moment, treading the ankles and the knees and the heels just a bit to work the stiffness out. And then we'll change sides and bring your left foot forward, please. The same, this time sleeping swan is first. So you bring that knee out and the foot up as far as you feel comfortable without any duress on the knee. And then lay your body slowly over and down. And once again, the two sides of the body will be different. Sometimes just minute differences, sometimes dramatic differences between the two sides. Once again, just to reiterate, for Chrysandra and for people like her who have what's called an external rotation here in the hip, to bring the foot up such as this, at this height to the chin and the chest level, is a natural progression of her trying to follow what gives her the best stretch through this band of tissue, through this region of the body. If I were to contrive to take Brian and lift him and shove this foot forward up to here so that he looked like the way Chrysandra's doing it, I would not increase the stress here through his buttock and the lateral part of his thigh. I would primarily put more stress into his knee, into his ankle, particularly his knee. This is not at all desirable. The primary intention of this posture is the gallbladder channel, the iliotibial tract, right down lateral to the SI joint and down to the lateral part of the thigh. Very important to try to keep that particular tract flexible. And once again, sometimes due to muscular tensions or fascial tensions, not so much ligamentous tensions in this pose, but fascia or muscle. If you look from one person to the other, their pelvis aren't the same. Chrysandra's pelvis is actually tilted back, slightly up like this. That's what helped her bring her foot very far forward. Brian's pelvis is actually tilted more flat to the floor, and he's sitting lower to the floor, but his foot isn't as high. Torsten is almost perfectly evenly, symmetrically suspended. This hip and thigh is not on the floor, neither is this buttock and thigh on this side. His pelvis is just floating in that position, hopefully giving him a nice stress through here, possibly through here as well. Susie is slightly off the floor here, but this thigh is on the ground. So no two of these four people, their pelvis is exactly in the same position. It's always like that. Because the shape of the femur bone, the neck of the femur, where the acetabulum is on their pelvis, all different. So even if they were all completely elastic and flexible in the extreme, their bones would contrive them to look slightly different. So should or could a student roll their pelvis this way to exaggerate the stretch? Or should it be the opposite? Should I roll this way to exaggerate the stretch? Only experimentation can tell you and answer that question, because what works for one person doesn't work or is ineffective for somebody else. So even though it's yin yoga, and we're trying to be quiet and we're trying to be still, we're trying to stay in these postures for long periods of time, in real life, on real bodies, with real people, the muscles are always involved. And because the muscles are always involved, it can be helpful to tense, relax, Wiggle your pelvis to one side, wiggle your pelvis to the other side. This is not fidgeting. This is an intelligent, conscientious, purposeful way to find the opening into the body as these openings present themselves. And then the swan itself, arch the body up. And as you come up, feel free to adjust that front leg and foot position. Because it isn't so much about what are we stressing in the hip and the pelvis anymore. We're now trying to shift our focus and our attention to the lumbar spine and the pelvis, and perhaps the hip flexors on the back thigh. And once again, if you look at the various pelvis here, Chrysandra's pelvis and thigh are completely down on the floor. Both sides of Torsten's pelvis are off the floor. So these two pelvi are completely different. One is floating and suspended. One is pressed down onto the floor. Susie's left leg and thigh are on the floor. Right leg and thigh slightly rolled off the floor. Brian is a little bit more different. He's conscientiously rolled his right thigh more towards the floor, and his left thigh has slightly come off. No two people are going to find it exactly effective to hold their pelvis in exactly the same position. Follow the thread. The thread is your lumbar spine and the hip flexors on the back thigh. Whether you bend your knee, straighten your knee, keep your head up, or arch your head back, these are individual variations, very important individual variations and explorations, but they're not appropriate for everybody, because literally, not everybody has the bones for it. So you want to walk a line with yin of posturing yourself correctly so you feel the stresses, the beneficial stresses of the pose, but not trying to be aggressive. It's not about how it looks, it's about how it feels. And slowly release, please. And again, tread back into the downward dog, stretching gently your ankles and your knees. Okay, shoelace pose. If you'll sit down on the floor, and if everyone would start, at least in the beginning, with a loose or open shoelace, sometimes called square pose. Right leg goes over the left, the ankle on the knee. Left ankle is under the right knee. So these bones here parallel one another approximately. So this is a loose or an open shoelace pose, sometimes called square pose. And if you look at the differences here, Susie's leg is lying flat, Chrysandra's leg is lying flat, Torsten's leg is up just a bit, and Brian's leg is way up. These differences in these body types is not due to muscular tension. We'll demonstrate very soon the differences here where the legs are placed are due to the skeletal differences. Now, if you will lay yourselves forward, trying to exaggerate the stresses here. Very similar, really almost biomechanically identical to sleeping swan is the stresses on the upper leg on this fascial band through here like this. It's essentially biomechanically identical to what we just did one leg at a time. But the added element here is not just that you're doing both legs up at the same time, but this rounding decompression and lateral decompression of the tissues around the sacrum and the lower spine. This rounding decompression here, coupled with this lateral pulling along the sacrum, is incredibly beneficial to try to get this sacrum from being compressed and jammed and fixated. As Brian comes forward, this knee really hasn't dropped at all. If we bring him back up, we're going to try to avoid where Brian is compressing in his hip joint right here. And the way we do that is we tighten up his shoelace or make it a tight shoelace. Then we allow him to stretch forward into this pose. Now he can lay flat. His chest is flat on his thigh, his knees are flat to one another. All that's been shifted is this point of compression in his hip. Now Brian too can have this stress down through the gallbladder channel here, and this rounding, gentle decompression both in this direction and in this direction, transversely, of this area of the pelvis and the lower back. Most modern peoples suffer tremendous decompression in this region of the spine. And this and similar movements are very difficult for them to do. 80% of the Western world suffers from major lower back complaints at one time or another, many of them chronic. Part of that reason is there's no longer a mobility in this region of the spine. Once you've isolated for yourself what the intention of the pose is, every other position is secondary. The knees, the feet, they're fairly locked in by how you started. Your hands, your head, what feels most comfortable to you. If this is an accurate thing to say, this is about as yin as it gets. There's no strength involved. There's no balance involved. And once you have any minor degree of facility in this posture, it is much more about ligaments and fascia than about muscle. So in a sense, this is like as yin as it gets. You're not developing strength. You're not building body heat. You're trying to let your bones fall apart and yield to the stresses this posture is putting upon it. And slowly come up, please. And change sides. Stretch out your legs. Bring the left leg over the right. And when you're ready, stretch forward and down. Two sides are different. Torsten on this side is slightly more compressed in his hip, can't go down quite as flat with his spine. For Susie, it's exactly the opposite. Her spine isn't rounded nearly as much as before because she's able to tilt her pelvis with more freedom of motion in this posture. Cassandra's slightly higher on this side than the other side. Brian, again, we see that with this wide shoelace position, our square pose is very difficult for him because of the shape of his bones. His bones literally don't allow this to occur. So again, Brian, if you tighten up your shoelace to a comfortable angle, he can get, literally, by repositioning his legs, he gets his bones out of his own way. And now he can slide down with great facility, pressing the knees together and pressing his thighs with his upper body and torso. So important to point out, because a lot of people labor under the illusion that the differences in their body are unique to them, that everyone else in the yoga world is perfectly balanced and symmetrical. This is not the case. No one is really perfectly balanced and symmetrical. Sometimes the differences between the left and the right side are very trivial, and you'd have to look really hard to see them or to feel them. And that's very fortunate if the differences are only that. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, there are significant differences between the two sides. The question comes up then, well, can you balance these asymmetries with your yoga practice? Should you spend twice as long on the tight side as the open side? These are variables that change from person to person. Some people feel that they can balance themselves out and spend more time on the quote-unquote tight side as opposed to the open side. Other people just live with it. There are questions that you can only answer for yourself as an individual. Time and experience will tell you. If you have an ambition to balance the two sides of your body and it's important to you, by all means you should pursue it. After time, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, things will probably change. And the ambitions that you had for your practice at the beginning will change over time. In this posture, as with all postures, how much an effort you make to extend the chest forward modifies how much the pelvis tilts forward. The more you extend your chest forward, the more you tilt your pelvis forward and work the legs. But that compromises somewhat the stretch on your back. So for most people, once you've made the initial effort to posture yourself, your job is just to yield and to wait. This is the difficult aspect of Yin Yoga. It's so tempting to want to be more aggressive, to use more weight, more force, more muscle, get there faster. You come to realize over a time that you can't. You can't rush it. The difficulty of Yin Yoga and the strength of Yin Yoga is learning what you can and you cannot do and developing patient endurance. And slowly release and come up, please. And stretch your legs out in front of you for a moment. Two more strong moves for the hips. First, the half saddle pose, and then we'll do the full saddle pose. So fold your right leg back, and then very carefully lower yourself backwards. Now I have asked Torsten to do this posture with his foot pointed this way, close to his body, and to allow his knee to drift slightly out to the side. The reason I asked him to do that, because I want him to do it as relaxed as is possible. Okay? And if you look at the different knee positions on the floor, we have a huge variety here. Susie's knee is swung out to the side, but her knee is down. Torsten's knee or thigh is swung out to the side. His knee is up. Chrysandra, at my request, has flexed her foot and moved it way out to the side. This exaggerates what's called the internal rotation of the femur. Brian has flexed his foot like Chrysandra, but has not pushed his foot out to the side. These two variations exaggerate the internal rotation, putting more stress here. If you don't have the hip for it here, trying to turn your foot this way is dangerous and destructive because you'll put too much stress on your knee. For many people, to even think about flexing their foot this way makes them cringe. And if that makes you cringe, by all means don't do it. This is not the DVD to explore all these skeletal differences. But you have to look and see that it's perfectly safe and actually effective for Brian and Cassandra to hold their body in this way. They can even, if they want, bend up the free leg to exaggerate the stretch on the thigh. Brian places his left foot on the floor. Cassandra can actually hug her left knee to her chest. This exaggerates the stress of this posture. Susie brings her left knee up. This also exaggerates the stress on the right thigh that's on the floor. For Torsten, because his knee is not down in this variation, it'd be unwise to try to exaggerate it in any way, by exaggerating his foot position in any way, or doing anything with his free leg. But the reason I wanted to demonstrate this posture is people have a morbid fear of their knee coming off the ground, as if something really, really bad is going to happen if the knee comes off the ground. Now, certainly it's possible if someone's really, really tight that doing this posture at all, laying back all the way, is too much stress for them. But very frequently, the knee coming off the ground is less stressful for the body than to try to press or contrive that knee to go to the floor. Torsten has the ability. I've asked him not to do that. When he relaxes, his leg is up. It's not about the knee touching the floor. It's this stress through here and a gentle arch in the iliosacral joint on the back side. Now roll to your left side, please, and release your leg. And then come back onto your back and hug your knee to your chest, cradling the knee. And then you can straighten that leg as well, flex your ankle a little bit, sort of work the kinks out of those joints. The feet and the knees sometimes take stress in certain of the yin postures, but they're never the target. The target is always up in the hips and the thighs and the back. But in order to get to the hips and the thighs and the back, sometimes we have to put modest stresses on these joints. So you want to take precautions to make sure you never overdo it. Okay, and then hug both knees to your chest, please. Stretch your legs up toward the ceiling. This is the hinge movement. The legs are straight, hands under your hips. You slowly bring your legs down, holding your feet just off the floor for a breath or two. And then before your feet touch, sit up all the way, please. Okay, and then the other side. Fold the left leg back. Half saddle pose. Relax your leg, Brian, that's good. Now, we have Torsten's knee in the air, Brian's knee in the air. There are always exceptions to every rule. There are exceptions to every rule, so always be cautious with whatever I or anyone else says. But frequently, it is more stressful to try and get your knee to the floor. It is less stressful to have the foot up, the knee up, I mean. The problem will be usually in this ankle or the foot. Letting the knee come up puts more stresses on the ankle and the arch of the foot. Well, that's not desirable. So it's not always possible. That's why there are exceptions that necessarily letting the knee come up will be less stressful. It might be less stressful here, but more stressful here. You are the judge of this. In your own practice, if you feel dangerously uncomfortable with your knee in the air, don't keep it there. But I want to bring this to your attention that maybe, just maybe, you will find in your experiments with your own body and your own practice, this is actually more comfortable to do, less stressful to do, and just as effective. And once again, pointing out the different foot positions. Susie's foot is pointed and tucked, the knee is coming out to the side. Torsten's foot is pointed, but his knee doesn't come out very far. Cassandra's ankle is flexed and her foot is pushed away from her body. And Brian's foot is flexed, but he hasn't pushed it away from his body. Several different positions. Chrysander, on this side, might choose to tuck her knee up. Brian, I don't know if he would do it or not. He'd have to tell me. Does he feel like it'd be fun to bring his foot up and tuck it? Does that exaggerate too much stress on the opposite side? Or is it fine? The stress of this pose should be here, which is stomach and spleen channel, and an arching movement in the iliosacral joint on the backside. Primary stress is here. Unfortunately, due to this awkwardness of this pose, and it is awkward for a lot of people, sometimes the stress in the knee and the stress in the ankle is too much. And even though they're experiencing a beneficial stress through the targeted area, the stresses through the knee and the stresses through the ankle are too much, and you have to come out. You cannot risk abusing your extremities, your knees and your ankles. Okay? They're too easy to overstress. And there's one last sort of anatomical scan of the group. Chrysander is exaggerating how much she's tilting her pelvis up on the left side in order to get more stretch through those tissues. Brian's pelvis is sloping down to his right, which means his pelvis is up on the left side, but this is natural. He's not forcing that. Torsten's pelvis is, even though the knee is up, the pelvis is nearly level to the two sides. Susie, by cradling her leg and holding out to the side, is also pushing her left pelvis, the left side of her pelvis up to exaggerate the stress on that. So having your pelvis level isn't necessarily the goal. You can see with the two women in the group that actually tilting the pelvis exaggerates the stress of the pose, opening them even further. And now we'll slowly come out of this posture as we did the other side, rolling slightly to your right, releasing the tension on the knee and the foot, then coming back onto your back, cradling the left knee into your chest. Make sure your iliopsoas muscle's okay, stretching your lower back slightly, and then you can stretch that leg as well, rolling your ankle, flexing and pointing your foot. The extremities sometimes take a beating in that particular posture, and you have to respect the weak link of the chain. It doesn't do any good to get a beneficial stretch on your thigh and your back and then injure your knee or overstress your foot. So you always have to be careful. And then again, hug both knees to your chest, cradling both legs. And then the hinge movement, hands under your hips, stretch your legs up. Bring your feet down slowly. Pause for just a breath or two, a little bit above the floor, and then sit up all the way. And as you might have expected, having stretched one thigh at a time, now we stretch both in the full saddle pose. So if you'd sit on or between your feet. That is the major variation. Do you sit on your feet or with the feet very close to the buttocks? Or do you actually sit between your feet wide apart? Susie sits on her feet, her knees come apart to any comfortable natural angle and slowly goes back. Torsten sits between his feet, but going back all the way is too stressful on his knees and his ankles. So we use a bolster so that when he goes back, we do not overstress his extremities, his knees and his ankles. And again, the knees are going to come to some comfortable, unforced, uncontrived width. For some people, it's the natural thing for them to have their knees nearly together or parallel. For other people, it's completely against the natural contour and shape of their body. And to force the knees together, if we have Torsten try and squeeze his knees together, it's going to put a lot of stresses in his ankles and his knees, and he's not going to be successful. And as soon as he stops using his muscles, his knees will fly apart again. In Taoism, this is called following the watercourse way, the path of least resistance. The hips, the acetabulums, the hip sockets of the body do not sit the same on everybody. So we have a stream of variations here, again reflecting deep skeletal differences in our body types. Susie is at one extreme. She's actually sitting on her feet, knees apart. Minimal stress to the knees, more arch to the back and stretch to the thigh. Torsten is sitting between his feet, knees apart. Brian is sitting between his feet, but his knees are nearly together. In fact, if I ask Brian, squeeze your knees together, he can do this. If he relaxes, his knees will also move apart slightly, boom. And then finally, Chrysandra, feet flexed. This is very difficult. Difficult's not even the right word. Either you have the bones for this or you don't. If you don't have the bones for this, and you will know the first time you ever attempt it, and you try to sit with your feet this way, you're going to ruin your knees. But for Chrysandra, it's easy. It actually exaggerates the beneficial internal rotation of the thigh, giving her a better stretch through here to have her feet positioned this way. This is perhaps the climactic back bend. The flexibility of these tissues and the flexibility of the lumbar spine and the iliosacral joint are intimately connected. Stretching these and compressing these are the yin and yang of a very powerful movement. And this is the posture that scares most people, and perhaps rightly so. If you've not done any yoga before or stressed your knees or your joints slightly to prepare them for this motion, this can be quite scary. Particularly if you try to force your knees or your feet to a certain position your skeleton doesn't allow. The safest, least stressful way to accomplish this pose would be a combination of Torsten and Susie. Sitting on the feet is the least stressful for the knees, knees apart. If even that were too stressful, we would put a bolster under Susie's back. Torsten is using the bolster, which is helpful, but he's sitting between his feet, which is slightly more stressful. So they've chosen opposite extremes of what they're trying to balance. Susie doesn't use the bolster, but sits on her feet. Torsten uses the bolster, which allows him to sit between his feet. These are individual choices that you make, depending on you prefer to exaggerate the stress in the thighs or the back. Brian sits between his feet and doesn't use a bolster. And the final step in hip flexibility, and again, you either have it or you don't as far as your bones, is what Chrysandra is doing. Knees nearly together or straight parallel, and the feet turned out. And as you can see, each one of these people is very comfortable in what they're doing. But if one of them were trying to adapt the variation of the other, they would probably be very uncomfortable. So in spite of their differences, they're all stressing this tissue and the arch of the lumbar spine and the sacrum. So there are differences, but they are minor. What they share in common is far more important. Notice the arm positions that people have chosen slightly different. Susie's arms stretched over her head. Torsten's arms relaxed by his side. Brian's hands by his heart. Chrysandra's hands by her hips, perhaps checking to see if they still work. Slowly come up, please. I'm asking Brian and Chrysandra to stay down for a moment. This is typically how a person gets out of this pose, using the arms to slowly assist you, and then coming forward onto your hands, lifting the stress out of your knees and your ankles, and then stretching the legs back, slowly going into downward dog. These two found that posture the most challenging for their knees and their ankles, so they take great precautions when they come out. Brian and Cassandra, their pelvis allow an easier motion here. They can either just bend the knees and release the feet, both at the same time, or if that's too much, first one thigh and then the other. Then they can hug their knees to their chest, rock and roll a few times, and come up and move yourself into downward dog. This is the least stressful way to get out of that posture. But if you don't have the knees for it, and you don't have the ankles for it, it's not an option to you. And you have to come out the way Susie and Torsten did. Just a moment to stretch out your knees, your ankles, and your feet. You don't need to be static. You can tread the ground, flex and move the muscles a bit. And finally, we'll come to a sitting position. So Susie and Brian will sit, whereas we'll ask Cassandra and Torsten to relax. These are two different, completely viable options of how to end any yoga practice, any yin practice. Pentacle is you sort of relax your legs a little wider than perhaps you'd be standing. And you raise and open your heart and your chest, arms splayed out. So you have the 5 points of the head, the arms, and the feet. This is a classic, if there is such a thing, pentacle position. But the most important thing is to be comfortable. So if you're not comfortable with your arms over your head, then go ahead and bring your arms down at some lower level, any comfortable level. If your legs are not comfortable at the width that they are, bring them in or out to a more comfortable position. This is one way to relax after a yoga practice. The other way is to sit very quietly upright, the way Brian and Susie are, so you can feel very consciously and attentively the energy moving and pulsing through the body. Yin yoga tends to temporarily stop or block chi movements while you're in the long postures. And then when you come out of them, there's a release or a rush of blood and chi through the tissues that were bent or compressed or stretched. So it can be quite pleasant and quite informative to sit for a time after your practice and feel the natural pulsing and movement in the body. The same can occur on the floor. Completely relaxed, each breath quieter, feeling the weight of the body, relaxing all tensions, drifting calm. Sitting is like an exaggerated introspection at this point. You're relaxed but alert. Relaxing in the pentacle, you just relax further and further and further. Which option any student might choose as a way to end their practice is an individual choice based on them, their experience, their preferences. And is it morning? Is it evening? Are you sick? Are you healthy? Is it summer? Is it winter? Now, if you're relaxing, slowly gather yourself in and gently bring yourself up to a comfortable sitting position. Bring your hands, palms together. Namaste.